So you want to own an 1880s frontier cattle ranch. You see yourself sitting tall in a saddle. Sunlight is washing over millions of acres of open green grass. Around you, thousands of Texas longhorns thunder across the prairie. You bought those cattle down on the Rio Grande for next to nothing. You are going to sell them in Chicago for a fortune. You are not just a cowboy. You are a cattle baron. One number ruins the picture. In 1884, a 4-year-old grass-fed steer bought in San Antonio for $4 could sell for $35 at the Chicago Union Stockyards. That looks like an 800% gross return. It wasn't. By the time that steer stepped off a stock car in Illinois, transport costs, trail wages, weight loss, yardage fees, and meatpacker syndicates had eaten $31 of that margin. You think you are buying cattle. You are actually speculating on free grass. By the end of this video, we are going to reconstruct the actual ledgers of an 1880s range operation. We will examine what it really cost to drive, feed, fence, and market a herd, and why the ultimate collapse of the open-range cattle boom was baked into its own economics from the very first trail drive. To understand how this worked, you have to understand the map of post-Civil War America. Texas was cattle-rich and cash-poor. Millions of wild longhorns roamed the brush country. They were worth practically nothing locally. Rawhide and tallow were often worth more than the meat. Meanwhile, the industrializing North had an insatiable appetite for beef. Factory workers in New York and Chicago needed cheap protein. Then came the federal government's land policy. After the Indian Appropriations Acts and the widespread displacement of native tribes, millions of acres of the Great Plains became public domain. Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, and the Dakotas were vast stretches of unfenced grass. Ranchers realized something extraordinary. They did not need to buy land. The public domain was completely free to graze. If you bought a steer in Texas for $4, an amount equal to roughly 1.5 days of a skilled carpenter's labor at the time, and walked it north onto public land, that animal would eat wild prairie grass for 2 years at zero rent cost. It would gain hundreds of pounds of fat. Then you loaded it onto a train and sold it for cash. It was an energy arbitrage. You were taking free solar energy, stored in wild prairie grass, converting it into animal fat, and selling that fat to urban workers via the new transcontinental railroad network. Capital flooded the plains. Investors in London and Edinburgh saw the paper margins and lost their minds. Scottish investment trusts pooled millions of pounds sterling to buy up American herds. Syndicate managers promised 30% annual dividends. They thought they had discovered a perpetual motion machine for money. The primary records of this era tell a different story. If you open the surviving 1884 capital ledgers of the XIT Ranch, a massive 3 million-acre operation backed by Chicago investors, or examine the brand registers of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association from 1885, the real costs immediately start to bleed through the ledger paper. Grass was free. Moving cattle across it was not. To get a herd from Texas to the northern shipping hubs in Kansas, Nebraska, or Wyoming, you had to hire a trail crew. A standard drive managed about 2,500 head of cattle. You needed a trail boss, you needed 10 to 12 cowboys, you needed a wrangler to handle the horse remuda, you needed a cook and a chuck wagon. The wages added up fast. A standard cowboy on the trail earned $25 to $30 a month plus food. That meant a single wrangler earned in a full month what a skilled urban carpenter could make in about 10 days. The work was brutal, dirty, and dangerous. The trail boss made up to $100 a month. Food provisions for a 3-month drive cost hundreds more. Then came the hidden physical cost. It was called shrinkage. Cattle are not freight boxes. They are living biological systems. When you drive a herd 15 miles a day through heat, dust, and river crossings, they burn calories. If a steer grazes poorly along the choked trail, it loses weight. A steer that loses 50 to 100 pounds between Texas and Kansas has just shed 10 to 15% of its market value into the prairie dust. Stampedes burned fat. Mud burned fat. Alkali water poisoned stock. If a drive ran into a dry stretch without water, cattle lost weight rapidly. If they crossed river crossings controlled by local Indian nations or homesteaders, you paid per-head transit tolls. By the time the herd reached northern pastureland or the railhead town, trail expenses added $2 to $3 of cost per head. That still left a massive theoretical margin, but the real friction was waiting at the railhead. Enter the railroad companies and the Chicago stockyards. Once your cattle reached a town like Dodge City, Abilene, or Cheyenne, you were no longer operating in an open competitive market. You were entering a tightly controlled logistical bottleneck. Railroads held a geographic monopoly on livestock shipping. In the early 1880s, freight rates to ship a single cattle car from the plains to Chicago ranged from $100 to $150. You could pack roughly 22 steers into one cattle car. That added another $5 to $7 per steer just for railroad freight. And the expenses didn't stop when the stock car doors slid shut. During transit, cattle had to be unloaded every 28 days by federal law to be fed and watered. The railroads charged high prices for that feed along the line. When the train finally ground to a halt in Chicago, the cattle entered the Union stockyards. The stockyards were a sprawling 360-acre city of timber pens, open sewers, and slaughterhouses. It was one of the most concentrated industrial complexes on Earth, and it was run as an oligopoly. The moment your cattle were unloaded into a pen, yardage fees began ticking. You paid for the pen rental. You paid premium prices for the hay and corn fed to your animals. If you did not like the price offered for your cattle on Monday, you could hold them until Tuesday. But holding them meant paying high daily feed rates in the yards. Worse, cattle kept in stockyard pens lost weight every day. Their quality degraded. The buyer knew this. Time was on their side, not yours. The buyers were not independent butchers competing against one another. The market was dominated by four massive meatpacking firms: Armour, Swift, Morris, and Hammond. They were known as the Big Four. The packers understood their power. Instead of competing against each other to drive steer prices up, they quietly coordinated. Buyers from the packing houses would walk the alleys of the stockyards, inspect the pens, and offer a flat rate per 100 pounds. If a rancher rejected an offer from Armour's buyer, Swift's buyer would wander over an hour later and offer the exact same price, or less. The rancher was trapped. They could not walk the cattle back to Wyoming. They could not afford to keep paying stockyard feed fees for weeks. They had to take the price offered on the day. The meat packers had created a buyer's cartel. They bought live cattle cheap on the stockyard floor, then they slaughtered them using highly efficient assembly lines, packed the meat into Gustavus Swift's new fleet of refrigerated rail cars, and sold the dressed beef to eastern cities at a massive markup. The meat packers took the steady profits. The ranchers took all the biological and weather risks on the open range. And then the underlying foundation of the ranching model, that free grass, began to disintegrate. It looks like grass was free, but economically, open-range ranching relied on an unregulated commons, and open commons always attract overinvestments until they collapse. By 1883, word of the cattle boom spread worldwide. Everyone with extra capital bought cattle. Ranchers overstocked the plains. Hundreds of thousands of animals were turned loose on ranges that could only sustainably support half that number. The grass began to disappear. High stocking rates ruined the native perennial grasses. Weeds took over. Then came the technological disruptor that changed the math forever: barbed wire. Patented by Joseph Glidden in 1874, barbed wire was cheap to produce and easy to string. Homesteaders moving west under the Homestead Act started fencing off water holes and quarter sections of land. Ranchers realized that if they didn't control water, their cattle would die. The age of zero land cost was over. To protect your range, you had to buy or lease land. You had to buy posts. You had to buy thousands of spools of wire. You had to hire labor crews to build miles of fence. Installing a 4-strand barbed wire fence in the mid-1880s cost roughly $100 to $200 per mile. If you wanted to enclose a modest 20,000-acre range, you were looking at tens of miles of boundary lines. That meant thousands of dollars in capital expenditure, equal to several years of an average worker's income just to protect grass you used to use for free. The business has shifted. It went from a low-overhead operational trade into a high-overhead, capital-intensive real estate fight. Ranchers went to banks in Cheyenne, Denver, and Chicago to take out high-interest mortgages on land and stock. They were heavily leveraged, they had huge fixed debt costs, and their ranges were dangerously overstocked. The entire system was stretched razor-thin. It was waiting for a spark. What it got was the worst environmental disaster in the history of the American West. It started in the summer of 1886. A severe drought scorched the northern plains. The grass dried up and died before the cattle could build up their winter fat reserves. Rivers and creeks shrank to trickles. Ranchers knew they were in trouble, but the Chicago prices were weak due to the glutted market. Many chose not to sell their stock at a loss. They decided to hold their underweight herds on the overgrazed range through the winter, hoping prices would recover in the spring. It was a fatal miscalculation. In November 1886, the blizzards hit early and hard. Temperature gauges snapped. Cold air swept down from Canada, dropping temperatures to 40, 50, and 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Massive snowstorms buried the short prairie grass under deep crusts of ice. Under normal open range conditions, cattle would drift south with the wind, moving dozens of miles to find sheltered coulees and exposed grass on bare ridges. But now the range was crossed with barbed wire. Thousands of miles of newly strung fences blocked the cattle's natural movement. Herds drifting south ahead of the freezing winds ran straight into impenetrable lines of wire. They stopped. They piled up against the fences by the thousands, standing shoulder to shoulder in the freezing wind. They could not move forward. They could not get to grass. They froze to death where they stood. Animals blinded by snow drifted into drifted riverbeds and drowned under the ice. Starving cattle ate the bark off cottonwood trees and swallowed barbed wire trying to reach frozen grass on the other side. The winter raged for 4 months. It became known as the Big Die-Up. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1887, the full scale of the catastrophe was exposed. Riverbanks were lined with thousands of rotting cow carcasses. Entire herds had been wiped out. Operational losses across Wyoming, Montana, and Dakota were reported between 50 and 80%. Some ranches lost 90% of their stock in a single season. The financial dominoes fell instantly. When cattle mortality hit those levels, the paper values of ranching operations evaporated overnight. Banks called in their loans. Scottish investment trusts folded in panic. Rangeland values crashed. The open-range cattle boom was dead. Before we look at how individual ranchers survived or failed, we need to look directly at the math that caused this crash. No pristine single ledger exists that covers every ranch across this vast geography. The numbers that follow are a historical reconstruction. They combine documented average prices, transport rates, mortality statistics, and labor costs drawn from the accounting ledgers of the XIT Ranch, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association records, and Chicago stockyard receipts from 1882 to 1887. Let's look at a medium-sized operation managing a working herd of 10,000 head of cattle on the northern plains. First, consider a good year, the ideal market conditions of 1882. The ranch turns over 2,500 fat steers sent to market. At a strong Chicago sale price of $35 per head, gross revenue comes in at $87,500. Now, subtract the operating costs. Trail costs and wages for the spring roundup and drive run about $7,500. Railroad freight for 2,500 head at $6 per steer takes $15,000. Stockyard fees, feed charges, and sales commissions in Chicago take another $2,500. Range maintenance, winter feed supplements, cowboy winter wages, replacement bulls, and local taxes consume $12,000. Total annual operating costs come to $37,000. That leaves a gross operating profit of $56,500. That looks like a home run, but wait. A realistic reconstruction must subtract a fair market value for the owner's unpaid management labor and capital interest. If the ranch owner invested $80,000 of capital to buy the initial herd and equipment, and you deduct a standard 8% interest costs of $6,400 plus a manager's salary of $3,000, the true net economic profit drops to $47,100. Converted using our wage day benchmark, that net return equals roughly 62 years of a skilled carpenter's wages. In a good year, the open range made men rich. Now, let's look at an average year, the tightening market of 1884. The range is getting crowded. Cattle weight is down due to thinner grass. The Chicago price slips to $26 per steer. Gross revenue on 2005 steers drops to $65,000. Operating costs, however, do not drop. In fact, they rise. Rail freight and yard fees remain fixed at $17,500. Labor, roundup costs, and trail charges stay at $8,000. Because homesteaders are crowding the range has been forced to fence key water holes. Debt service on fence loans adds $4,000 in interest payments. Total operating expenses come to $41,000. Net operating profit drops to $24,000. After deducting capital interest and management labor, the true net economic profit shrinks to $14,600. That represents about 19 years of a skilled worker's earnings. Still profitable, but the safety margin is shrinking fast. Now, let's look at a bad year, the disaster of 1886 to 1887. Winter die-off wipes out 60% of the herd. Instead of selling 2,500 steers, the ranch can only gather 800 surviving, emaciated animals. Market prices in Chicago have collapsed because panicked ranchers are dumping dying stock all at once. The price plunges to $14 a steer. Gross revenue on 800 steers brings in just $11,200. Now look at the expense side. Fixed debt service on fenced land and livestock loans must still be paid. $8,000.
Roundup labor is actually more expensive because cowboys have to search vast areas to find surviving stock. $6,000. Freight and stockyard fees on the 800 steers take $5,600. Emergency hay bought during the storm costs $5,000. Total operating costs spike to $24,600. The net operating result is a loss of $13,400. Add in the loss of asset value, the thousands of dead cattle rotting on the range, representing tens of thousands of dollars in lost principal capital, and the total net loss for the year exceeds $70,000. That single year's loss wiped out more than 93 years of a skilled worker's earnings. The entire paper wealth built over a decade vanished in 4 months. To see how this math destroyed real institutions, look at the case of the Swan Land and Cattle Company. Organized in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1882 by Alexander Hamilton Swan, the company was a monster enterprise. It was capitalized at £300,000 sterling, over $1.4 million at the time. Swan was known as the Cattle King of Wyoming. His company controlled over 4 million acres of open range across Wyoming and Nebraska. At its peak, the company claimed to own over 100,000 head of cattle. It was listed on the Scottish Stock Exchange. Investors received annual dividends of 9 to 10%. It seemed like an unsinkable empire. But the business model was built on a critical accounting lie. It was called the book count. Because it was impossible to count every cow across thousands of square miles of unfenced plains, ranches kept track of their inventory on paper. If you started with 10,000 cows, assumed a 80% calf crop every spring, and subtracted an estimated 5% annual winter loss, your ledger showed your herd was growing every year. You paid out real cash dividends based on those paper estimates. Alexander Swan paid out dividends based on book counts, but no one had actually rounded up and counted all the cattle in years. The book counts severely underestimated winter losses and calf deaths. The company was paying out dividends out of investment capital, not real operational earnings. Then came the winter of 1886. When the snows cleared in the spring of 1887, Swan's foreman rode out to gather the herd. The ledger said the company owned over 120,000 head of cattle. When the roundup was finished, they had counted less than 30,000 surviving animals. Over 3/4 of the company's physical assets were dead carcasses in the coulees. The company was hopelessly over-leveraged. It owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to banks in Cheyenne and Dundee. It could not pay the interest on its debt. In May 1887, the Swan Land and Cattle Company went into bankruptcy. Alexander Swan was ousted, stripped of his fortune, and ruined. The Scottish investors lost millions. The stock became practically worthless. The Swan case proved what the smart money was beginning to realize. The cattle business was not a sustainable long-term yield machine. It was a high-risk extraction game. So who actually got rich? If cattle ranching on the open range was a financial trap, how did some individuals exit that era with massive fortunes? The answer reveals the true underlying mechanism of frontier wealth. The people who made permanent fortunes did not stay in the cattle business. They used cattle as a vehicle to secure control of the permanent underlying infrastructure of the West. Look at Francis E. Warren. Warren arrived in Wyoming in 1868 as a veteran of the Civil War with almost no money. He started out working in a mercantile store in Cheyenne. He got into the cattle business early, building up herd holdings during the late 1870s. But Warren understood something that Alexander Swan and the Scottish syndicates missed. He realized that the cattle were temporary, but the land, the water, and the urban infrastructure were permanent. Warren used his early cattle revenue to buy key parcels of real estate along riverbanks under the Homestead Act and Desert Land Act. He did not buy land just to feed cows. He bought the land that contained the water sources. If you owned the water on a stream, you effectively controlled tens of thousands of acres of surrounding public land without paying a cent for it, because no one else's cattle could survive there without your water. Then, as land values rose, Warren diversified rapidly out of live cattle. He took his profits and launched the Cheyenne Electric Light Company. He built waterworks, real estate developments, and city streetcars. He founded banks.